He's younger in that series. I'm just gonna give some of my favorite Simon Peter stories and just talk about what we know about him. We're going through these series on the apostles. I have a goal here, and that is I just want us to feel like we're friends with these guys, or that we know them, or we're acquainted with them, and we kind of know where they're coming from. And I just want us to know as much about them as we can, because they're so important. The Gospels are not the story of 12 heroes. Jesus is the protagonist. He's the hero. But these 12 were so important. Stand with me. Let's read this. 22 of Matthew 14. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. Remember, he had just fed the 5,000. After dismissing the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Well into the night, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat was already some distance from land, battered by the waves because the wind was against them. Jesus came toward them walking on the sea very early in the morning. Scholars think this was around 4 in the morning when this happened. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, this is the Sea of Galilee, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. Immediately Jesus spoke to them. "Have courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Of course, you know he says, "I am" is here. He's saying, "I am." "Lord, if it's you," Peter answered him, "command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And climbing out of the boat, Peter started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Shortest prayer in the Bible. "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught hold of him and said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And then those in the boat worshipped him, Jesus, and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." God's people said, Amen. Please be seated. You know, it sounds like Jesus was kind of chiding him there, putting him down. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" It sounds like he's really fussing at him, but it may have been more like, and I've heard scholars say that it may have been more like, "Peter, you were doing so well. What happened to your faith? You know, you had the faith to step out of the boat, but then you started looking at your circumstances and you started to sink." And that's exactly what we do. We take our eyes off of Jesus, we start looking at our circumstances, and our faith starts to decline. It's exactly what happens to us, and that's exactly what happened to Peter. And I think Jesus said, "What happened to your faith? You had the faith to come out here with me." And one of the things I love about this story is that here it's a storm, and they're scared, they're terrified, and now they think they see a ghost. And Peter would rather be out there in the water, in the storm, than in the safety of the boat. He'd rather be out there with Jesus than anywhere else. And I think that's for us to see as well. Doug?
Brother, I'm sorry to interrupt because
Sure.
we don't normally do this, but is it possible with this right here that he was setting up Peter for the future because of what Peter did as far as denying him 3 times, and this is gonna hit him right between the eyes when Jesus looked at him and Peter realized that he had denied him, and he looks back at this time.
Absolutely, Doug. That's very that's very good insight. The Holy Spirit spoke that to you. That's very good insight. Yes, of course, God is setting him up to do what he's going to have to do and to do what he's going to do. And we're going to see some interesting comparisons to him jumping out of the boat and swimming to Jesus in John 21. Yes, that you're seeing that connection there. I think the Holy Spirit is showing that to you. You know, when we looked at some of the disciples, they're mentioned 3 times in the Bible, or 4 when the lists are given, and that's all we know. I mean, we know that they're all from Galilee because Acts 4 tells us that, but we just don't know. Simon Peter's mentioned 120 times in Gospels. And so he's very important. And when Matthew's listing the disciples, he says, first and foremost, meaning the leader of the 12 is Simon Peter. And so let's look at just a couple of passages. And Roy, don't even try to keep up, if you will, because I'm going to try to go fast. But in John chapter 1, we've already looked at this. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard John. Now, that's John the Baptist, remember? And followed him. So Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist. Remember that? The first thing he did was found his own brother Simon and told him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated the Christ. And he brought Simon to Jesus. And when Jesus saw him, he said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which is translated Peter. Okay? So, according to John chapter 1, the first thing Jesus said to Peter was to give him the name Peter. I think we tend to think that it wasn't until Matthew 16 when he makes this confession, because Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I'm going to build the church." And so I think sometimes we tend to think that's when Jesus first started calling him Peter. And in fact, in The Chosen, I don't think Jesus has ever called him Peter yet, has he? I think they're waiting until that scene, and that's when he's going to give him his name. But remember, John wrote his gospel much later than the synoptics, and he's telling us something that was implied in Matthew. And notice it's Matthew 16 where Jesus first calls him Cephas. And by the way, I heard a YouTube guy say Cephas. I've always said Cephas. But I heard a YouTuber call him Cephas. So I'm going to call him Cephas, and so I can sound really smart today. So I don't know. Somehow that just sounds better. Cephas, that means Peter. That means rock. Okay, that's Aramaic. But it's in Matthew 16 where Peter makes his confession. This is Matthew 14, and he's already calling him Peter. And so I think that's telling us that what John's telling us is true. The minute Jesus met Simon, he named him Peter. He named him Cephas. I think that's what we see from John chapter 1. And so he's Simon, son of John. So now we know that Andrew and Peter's father's name was John. And so he called him, in the King James it would have said Simon Bar-Jonah. Bar meaning son of. You know what that's the equivalent of today. He says, "You're Simon Johnson." That's where that word Johnson comes from, John's son. And so that really was his name. If you want to really transliterate it to today, his name was Simon Johnson, because that's where that comes from. So you're Simon, son of John, but I'm going to call you Cephas. I'm going to call you Peter. So that's when Peter first meets Jesus. That's John chapter 1. Andrew introduces him to him. And they spent the afternoon with him. And then Jesus went and had some things. Well, actually, he took them with him in John chapter 2 to the wedding at Cana. But then he went to the desert and he was tempted. And apparently Jesus had some business to do. But then he calls Peter and Andrew and James and John again. They had gone back fishing. And now he does an official "come follow me," and this is permanent. So apparently they first met Jesus, and then they went to the wedding, and then they kind of did their own thing for a little while, and then they got back together. Let's see if we can see that in Matthew chapter 4. As Jesus was walking along the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. "Follow me," he told them, "and I will make you fish for people." Or fishermen of men, a fisher of men. Fish for people. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And then the next words in that paragraph are, and then he called James and John. He keeps walking. He runs into the sons of Zebedee, James and John. So these are the first four. These are his primary apostles, his primary first called disciples. They're all fishermen. They're all fishing. And Jesus comes up and he finds Simon and Andrew, and he says, "Follow me." he had already given him the name Peter. He had already been introduced to him. Peter had already seen him change the water into wine. But then he's gone back fishing. I mean, it would have been extremely difficult for him to just been out there fishing, minding his own business, and some stranger walks up and says, "Hey, come follow me. I'll make you a fisher of men." And he would have said, "Well, I don't want to be a fisher of men. This is my living. This is how I'm making a living. I'm doing just fine. Nice to meet you." I mean, it would have been impossible almost for him to just leave his nets and follow a stranger. So really, when you look at the Bible in context, it makes more sense. Because, okay, well, he'd already met him. He'd already seen him turn water into wine. He was already familiar with this man. And then when he comes up and says, "Hey, follow me full time. Come follow me, and I'm going to make you a fisher of men." And he did. He left his nets. He and Andrew looked at each other. They looked at their dad, who was probably on the boat with them, Jonah or John. That's the same thing. And they looked at him, and he, and so they went. And then Jesus goes down, and the same thing happens with James and John and their father Zebedee. And they left their nets and followed him too, because they had already been introduced to him. They'd already seen what he could do. They already were. Andrew in John chapter 1 says, "We found the Messiah." And so now it's starting to make a little bit more sense on a human level to understand why these guys would leave their job. This is, somebody comes and asks you to leave your job and follow them. That's tough. That's going to take some doing. And so apparently we're kind of seeing that this happens here. This picture that I have, he's mad at everything at Matthew here. Remember, Matthew probably was his tax collector, because they both lived in Capernaum, and the Chosen brings that out, that Matthew probably collected taxes from Peter, and he didn't like him. And it took Jesus to melt his heart and to soften his heart, and that they would even get along with each other. And so this is one of the things that we see. And so that's one of the reasons why I picked that picture, because he's kind of looking mad there, and and he kind of says he gets mad and says some things. And there were some pictures of him, he looked really peaceful and handsome, but I just don't want us to think of him that way. I want him to think he's one of us. He gets mad, he gets upset. Well, he's the one that gets to make this confession. Remember, Andrew had already said, "We've found the Christ." But Simon Peter gets credit for saying, "You are the Messiah." Well, let's look at that story. This is in Matthew 16, 13 through 18. You don't even have to go there. I'll just read it. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do the people say that the Son of Man is?" And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But you," he asked them, "who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus responded, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it." So there's that statement. So let's look at the scene. They're in Caesarea Philippi. It's up north of the Sea of Galilee, up there. Beautiful area. There's a huge rock, and it's got a cave there, and there was a lot of idol worship there. And this is also where the Romans were worshiping Caesar. And so that's kind of the background of where they were. If you Google it, you can see pictures of this scene where they were. Have y'all been there by chance? Okay, yes, Dr. Lucy's been there. So, yes. Am I telling the truth about it? A huge rock there, and it's...
Pan worship.
Yeah, Pan. Yeah.
Back in Jesus' day.
Yes.
Yeah, and the Jordan River comes out from Mount Hermon.
Mount Hermon is the huge rock that's right there, right? Yeah. Yeah. And Pan means all the gods, and pantheism is everything's a god or whatever. So a lot of God worship there. And so, I mean, so there's a context here. This didn't happen in a vacuum. And he's saying, but who do you say that I am? And Peter said, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And he said, on this rock. Now he's saying it in front of this huge rock there at Mount Hermon. But people said, well, is he talking about Peter's confession? I think he's saying he's building his church on Peter and the disciples. Remember, Peter represents the 12. And he's saying, I'm going to build my church on you. Now we see this in John 15, that he's building his church on them, and he's letting them know that he's the vine, they're the branches. It has to come back to him. And so I think my opinion is he's not saying it's on this confession. I think because, of course, he was the Messiah. That's the whole thing. He came because he's the Messiah. What he's saying is, I'm going to build my church on you guys. Well, what that means to us in here today is that he's saying, I'm going to build my church on you. I mean, if we don't keep the church going, then it dies. If we don't tell our kids about Jesus, then they're not going to hear it from anything else. Okay? So it's up to us to keep the church going, to build the church, to build the kingdom. And he's building it starting with Peter, because he's the leader of the 12, and then the 12. And now he's kind of, to me, revealing why he ever gave him that name of Peter, is because that means rock. Petros. A petroglyph is writing on a rock. Petra means rock. Peter, Petra. And so he said, I'm going to build my church on you guys. And he goes on to say, you're going to have the keys to the kingdom. And he's talking about the church, what the church is going to do. Those that you forgive, they'll be forgiven. If you don't forgive, because it's up to us to teach about forgiveness and to teach people that they need to come and to repent. And so he's building that. Now there's another passage I want to look at right quick, and it's Luke 22, because I think this is a really important story that has to do with Peter. This is Jesus is telling them that he's about to be crucified. And of course, right after, in Matthew 16, right after he says, you're Peter and I'm going to build my church, and right after that, Peter said, Jesus said, and I'm going to suffer and die. And Peter said, oh no, you're not. And then what does Jesus call him? Satan. And so right after he says, I'm going to build my church on you, right after that he calls him Satan. It's just kind of ironic, because what Peter was saying was going against what Jesus needed to happen. And he was saying, that's the very temptation, is for me not to go through this. And so get behind me. And so here in Luke 22, and I'm going to look at 31 through 34. Simon. By the way, when Jesus is kind of chastising him, he calls him Simon. And when he's complimenting him, he calls him Peter. So here he calls him Simon. It's kind of like when your mom calls you by your full name, first, middle, and last. You know, Larry Craig Harris, get in here. You know you're in trouble, right? And so Savannah Page, all right? So we all know that. All right, so Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. But I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Lord, he told him, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. I tell you, Peter, well, he does call him Peter there. He said, the rooster will not crow today until you deny 3 times that you know me. And we know that story. And so it was out by a charcoal fire that Peter is there warming himself. John somehow was known. We'll talk about John next Sunday. And then Wade will be here the Sunday after that. And then we'll talk about Judas the Sunday after that. Okay, so that'll take us through July. Lord willing, that's the plan. We'll talk about John. But somehow John was known to the high priest. And so he and Peter were able to come into the courtyard while Jesus was inside on trial. And so Peter's outside in the courtyard, and he denies 3 different times. And the last time he even throws in cuss words and curses and says, I don't know the man. So he was scared. And so he tried to be so brave. He grabbed the sword and cut off Malchus's ear when they came to arrest Jesus. Of course, it's interesting. He didn't cut off a Roman soldier's ear. He cuts off the high priest's servant's ear. But he's trying to do something. And he cut off his right ear. And so that means he may have done it from behind if he was right-handed. So John kind of gives a little... Remember, we've talked about stuff like that. And so that's why we just need to know this stuff. It just needs to be our lives. It just needs to be infused in our lives that we know these stories. And we know. And so anyway, so Peter denies him 3 times. Now, when we get to Judas, we're going to talk about the difference between Peter's denial and Judas's betrayal. And I talked about this earlier. In case you missed that Sunday, I need to say, Peter loved Jesus. Judas did not. And we can see that from what happened. Peter wanted to protect Jesus. He wanted to stand up for Jesus. He says, I'm willing to die for you. But when it came right down to it, he was scared. And he denied him. And it killed him. I mean, he just wept bitterly. It's such an emotional thing that happened. And Jesus said, Satan wants to sift you like wheat. Well, what they would do is they would take wheat into a basket that kind of like a drainer. It had holes in it, and they would shake it. And he's saying he wants to shake you. He wants to sift you. And they would shake it so that the chaff would fall through or would fly out. And only the wheat kernels would be left. He's saying he wants to cull you. He wants to make you ineffective. Now just think if Peter hadn't have preached the sermon that launched the church. And I'm not even really discussing what happens to Peter in Acts. But remember, he's the one who, by the power of God, brought Dorcas back from the dead. Remember that? And so, I mean, just think, there wouldn't be a church if Satan had have knocked Peter out and made him ineffective. And he wanted to. And there was spiritual battle happening, and Jesus could see it. He said, Satan wants to sift you like wheat and make you ineffective, but I have prayed for you. And when you come back, because he could see the future, he says, when you come back, then strengthen your brothers. Same thing he's going to say in John 21, feed my sheep. When you come back, take your place of leadership. Be the leader. You are the leader. So you're going to take it back, but you're going to deny me tonight. And so very, very emotional stuff that we see. Interesting, Jesus says, but I've prayed for you. Wow. He said, you're going to fail tonight, but I've prayed for you. And when you come back, guys, look, God knows we're going to make mistakes. We're going to fall. We're going to deny. We're going to deny Him with our actions. We're going to deny Him with our lips. But He says, but I've prayed for you. And that goes for us too. When you come back. If that doesn't tell you that we can make mistakes and then come back, I don't know what passage would more clearly say that, because it clearly does. You're going to make a mistake. You're going to fail. You're going to fall. But when you come back. So this is what He's telling. One more story about Peter that I think we need to look at. And this is in John chapter 21, where Jesus tells him what's going to happen to him. It's very interesting that John includes this in his gospel account. You know, by the time John wrote this, John probably wrote his gospel narrative around 91, 2. Well, Peter had already died in 64. And so John saw all of this play out. And John writes Jesus' account, what Jesus said to Peter, and here's what he said. He says, truly I tell you, when you were younger, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go. And then John says this. He said this to indicate by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. And after he said this, he told him, "Follow me." And then this kind of interesting. So Peter turned around and saw John following them, and he said, "Well, what about him? Lord, what about him? If I want him to remain until I come," Jesus answered, "What is that to you? As for you, you follow me." And so the rumor spread to the brothers and sisters that this disciple, talking about John, would not die. He nearly didn't. He lasted to about 100 years old. Yet Jesus did not tell him that he would not die, but if I want him to remain, what's that to you? And so John's talking about a little rumor that got out that John wasn't going to die. But the whole point of it is that Jesus told Peter how he would die. That he says, when you're young, you can put your belt on, you can go where you want to go. But when you get older, and assuming that Peter was about Jesus' age, that would have put him at 64, retirement age, right? And so he's saying they're going to lead you and they're going to take you where you don't want to go. They're going to stretch out your hands. You know, is that a picture of crucifixion? It seems to be. Now, Nero was the emperor of Rome at the time in 64, and he crucified Peter. There was persecution of the church, and he took Peter and he crucified him. Now, all of church history seems to be in agreement that Peter said, "I'm not worthy to die like Jesus did, my Lord." And so they turned the cross upside down, crucified him upside down. And that's just universally believed and understood. The Bible doesn't say that. Now, the Bible does say you're going to stretch out your hand, they're going to take you where you don't want to go. So it was about that same year that Nero beheaded Paul and crucified Peter in 64. And so this is what happened to him. I want to go back to something that Doug was pointing out. Doug got a little bit ahead of me. When he walked on the water to talk to Jesus, in John chapter 21, they're all out in the boat, because remember, he said, "I'm going fishing." They went back fishing. This is after Jesus had appeared to them, and he had been resurrected, and they didn't know what to do. And so Peter says, "Well, I'm going to go fishing," and a lot of the disciples were with him. John tells us who all was with him: Nathaniel, Zebedee's sons, and two others, and Peter and Thomas, called the twin. And so we're going. I'm going to go fishing. And early in the morning, Jesus is standing on the shoreline. He says, "Caught anything, boys?" And they said, "Man, we hadn't caught anything all night." And he says, "Throw that net over." And they caught 153, fish. It was breaking the nets, and I mean, they actually tell you exactly how many fish it was. And John says, "That's Jesus." And so Peter takes his outer coat off, or robe off, so that he's basically just in his underwear, and he jumps into that water and swims to shore, about 100 yards. He was obviously in good shape and a good swimmer that he could do that. So that does remind you of him stepping out of the boat and walking to Jesus in the storm. This time he jumps out of the boat and he swims to Jesus. The storm is that Jesus had died, but that they had seen him back to life again. But now they're saying, "So what do we do? What are we going to do?" And so Jesus, when they get to the shore, the other disciples come on in with the nets, and they get to the shore, and Jesus has got a coal fire going on the shoreline. And that word coal there is only used twice in the New Testament. Once here, and the other time when it was outside the courtyard, and Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And so you see the connection there too. And so it's by this coal fire that Jesus reinstates Peter. He restores him. He asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And we've talked about this. This is a whole sermon in itself, of course, to cover the 3 denials. You see that? You see how we're connecting these things here. And so